Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Karen Graflin, and I am the Library Consultant for Inclusive Services and the Able Library Director with the Vermont Department of Libraries. We've partnered with Inclusive Arts Vermont to provide this series of workshops on accessibility in libraries with funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I hope that you find this training useful. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Heidi and Katie for the training.
Thanks, Karen. And as we begin, we pause to acknowledge the place we exist, connect, and create is the traditional unsurrendered territory of the Abenaki people, one of 5 Wabanaki nations who have a continued and enduring presence with this land. Presence with mountains, with vistas, with waters, forests, and winds. Presence with people, relations, culture, and creations. Presence with light. In Abenaki, the word waban refers to the white flickering light in the sky, and a ki is the word for land or the earth. So the Wabanaki are the people of the Dawnland. We acknowledge Abenaki ancestors past, present, and future. And thank you. Katie's going to put into the chat box spellings of Abenaki and Wabanaki, and also a resource for more information. We're aware that the auto captioning doesn't always translate the words accurately, and so we wanted to give that information. That will also be in the follow-up email. My name is Heidi Swevens. I use she, they pronouns. I'm the Director of Community Partnerships at Inclusive Arts Vermont. For access purposes, I'll do a verbal description of myself and surroundings. I have blue eyes and pale skin with short brown hair, and today I am wearing a button-down olive green shirt. Behind me is an abstract rectangular colorful painting against a white wall, and I'm really, really excited to be here with you today. Before that, I just want to also pause as a human with a heart. There's so many things happening in the world in the news, and just today with things in schools and close to home, just want to acknowledge that we're all humans first. And I'm probably going to shift gears and get really excited about the power of language because it's near and dear to my heart also. But just want to name that as a human, as a person, as a heart, there's something else going on. So hold space for that for all of you, wherever you are. Thank you for being here, just as you are. And Katie and I have lots to share with you, and appreciate that you're taking time to learn about language and accessibility with us. So Katie.
Great, thanks, Heidi. There's a message in the chat, so let me check that. Deanna says, thank you, of course. So I'm gonna start with a verbal description of myself and my surroundings. I'm Katie Miller. I have pretty pale skin with pink cheeks, and I'm wearing clear glasses, and today my silver and brown and blonde hair is up in a bun. I'm wearing a green and blue plaid shirt over top of a green t-shirt. And I'm seated in my bedroom, which has light gray-blue walls, big white dresser. I believe there's a potted plant over my shoulder and some chunky white trim. I would love for all of you to introduce yourselves in the chat box if you want to share your name and maybe what library you're associated with and the role and where in Vermont you're at. I'm always curious to hear that. And like Heidi said, we are all humans first and everything else after that. That's something we really believe in at Inclusive Arts Vermont. So we invite you to turn on your camera and, be here like visually with us, but if that doesn't feel good to you, that's fine too. If you need to be joined by humans, big and small, animals, you need to get up and walk around, you need to move your body, you need to use the restroom, just take care of whatever you need to take care of. We welcome you to come however you are today and with whoever is with you. Along the same lines, we welcome you to participate in a way that's meaningful for you. So that means camera on and off. You can offer thoughts in the chat box or spoken out loud. And we also invite you, if you speak today, the first time you speak, if you could share your name and your pronouns and do a brief verbal description like we did, just describe what you look like and your clothing and your surroundings. That would be great if you want to give it a try. Lastly, last sort of access thing is that we do have auto captioning on today, which are subtitles. So if you want to turn that on, you can, there's a few different ways you can do that. You can press the button that says CC, or you can turn on, you might need to press a button that says show subtitle. And there are options to make that stuff bigger and smaller too. And if you need tech help, feel free to send me a message in the chat and I will help you out. Oh, there's someone here. Bear with me while I multitask. Okay. All right, lastly, this session is being recorded today and it will be available on the Department of Libraries website after we're done. Okay, I'm gonna bring up our slides and then Heidi can take it away.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah.
So at our first workshop, we invited people to explore what comes to mind and heart when you hear the word disability or encounter the word disability. Oh, Katie, did you want to describe that slide?
Yeah, I just skipped past it really fast because we're not going to use it today, but I certainly can. So this one on the right-hand side, there's a abstract pink and blue swirly watercolor sort of background with the white Inclusive Arts Vermont logo. Underneath that in white font, it says the power of language. And on the left-hand side, there's a blue background. At the top, it says using the magic of the arts to make Vermont more accessible since 1986. There's a headshot of Heidi, and underneath that, a headshot of myself. And then it says Heidi Swevens, Director of Community Partnerships, and Katie Miller, Executive Director. This next slide that I just brought up is white with black text on top of it. And it says, what comes to mind when you encounter the word water?
Thank you. So today, this is going to be an interactive as the way that you can, and kind of a popcorn style thing. So first thought, best thought, or second thought, best thought. What comes to your mind when you encounter the word water? And we're going to get more deeply into language, but if you want to put it in the chat, raise a hand. Katie, I'm not sure what you're able to see with the screen share the way it is. So people just jump in.
Moving stuff around to try to be able to see all the things.
Okay. And there's not a right or a wrong to this. Just what comes to your mind when you encounter the word water?
So in the chat, there's Blue Wet summer program. This year's theme is Ocean of Possibilities. Blue Wet Ripples, Life, Blue and Fresh, Thirst, Cool, Ocean, Flowing, Ocean, Wet, Cool, Refreshing. I think of my blue water bottle on my desk in Lake Champlain. My daughter, Relaxation, Floating, Peaceful, Thirst Quencher.
Great. Thank you. And thanks everybody. I'm going to just hold maybe another 30 seconds in case somebody's got another thought, wasn't able to type it in the chat or was inspired by something that they heard in the chat box from somebody else. What comes to mind when you encounter the word water? W-A-T-E-R. 5 letters. And maybe that's all for today. We bring this up because one word, 5 letters, water, in this example, has so many different meanings, even within the context of this very brief exercise. There's color, there's texture. Somebody mentioned a daughter, so that's personal connection and personal relationship. Thirst. The first time a colleague and I experimented with this exercise around the power of language, the word we were going to start with wasn't water, but I was early waiting outside the venue near Lake Champlain, and I just looked out and I was like, okay, let's just try with water. At that training, there was maybe 10 people, and it was in person, so there was a different feel for the conversation. But like you, it was things from beach and ocean and thirst quenching and color. And then one person from across the room said, fear of drowning. And in that fear, in that different vibe, we thought, and we kind of learned, and one of the things I learned was that the power of language is so much more than the word itself. It's the story and connections behind it. So we bring this up just to make it kind of ordinary with language, with water. And then we're going to get more into disability and the power of language as it relates to disability, that can be a bit more complicated in terms of lived experience. And not that water is not complicated, but thank you for sharing your ideas. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Katie, for what's next.
Great. So this slide, I'm going to describe this now, and then I'll talk about all the pieces and parts after. So it's a black or white slide, rather, with black text that says person first versus identity first language. And then there's a graphic on the lower right-hand side of two gray stick figure drawings. And above the one on the left, it says person with autism. And the gray stick figure has a bag in their hand that's filled with a rainbow gradient of color. And then on the right-hand side, it says autistic person above the stick figure. And that one is not holding a bag, but the inside of their head is filled with the rainbow gradient of color. So just out of curiosity, you can use the raise hand feature or physically raise your hand. You can do it in the chat. Who here has heard of person first language or identity first language, the term? Looks like a few. Okay, that's great. That's a great. So person first language was developed, I believe, in the 80s. And the idea behind person first language was to put the person before their disability. And so how you would go about using the person first language is you would say a person with a disability, a person with blindness or low vision, a person who uses a wheelchair would be person first language. Identity first language is the opposite of that. And it's become very popular among disability rights advocates and certain subsets of the disability community. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the nuance of that in a second. But identity first is the example in the illustration that's up here. So person first language is person with autism, and autistic person is the identity first language. So it puts that identifier, the disability, before the word person, quite literally. What I'm going to say about person first versus identity first language is that it's very personal and it's very nuanced. We as an organization still largely use person first language, but there are some circumstances where we're using identity first language. And part of that has to do with our communication with various people in the disability community, knowing certain groups' preferences, and knowing also that the disability community is slowly starting to make a shift towards identity first language. Person first language is still taught and is as the quote unquote right thing to do or correct thing to do in different service fields. So, you know, what we tell you today might be different than another organization uses, and that's sort of up to them and on them what they choose to use. So how do you know which one to use, right? How do you know whether to use person first or identity first language? The truth is that everybody has their own preferences, and you might use one and someone might correct you and say, actually, I prefer to identify this way. And the best thing to do with that is to just say, thank you so much for telling me, and then use that in the future. I'm going to give you a real life example, and I hope I put the slide in the picture. I did. Okay, so this slide is a white background, and on the left-hand side, there is a picture of a 4, nearly 5-year-old child who happens to be my kiddo. And so we have permission to use this picture. And she has very, very pale skin, red and pink glasses. She's holding a yellow cup of frozen yogurt and has big pink headphones on. And she also has a little sheep stuffed animal in her arms. And she's outside in a park. There's some grass and a bench behind her. And on the right-hand side, it says individuals and communities need to define their own identities. So this picture is of Maggie. This is my awesome 4.5-year-old that I talk about all the time. This is Maggie. Maggie was born with a genetic condition called albinism. And albinism is the same thing as being albino. It means that Maggie does not produce pigment in her hair, skin, or retina. She's also was born legally blind as a result of having albinism. It causes some physical changes to the eyes and the way that they are formed in the womb. And Maggie is also autistic. Now, what's really interesting about that when we talk about language is the albinism community still largely prefers person-first language. And there's even an acronym that a lot of people with albinism use. It's PWA. A lot of them will say like, I'm a PWA, and it's like the acronym they use. However, in the autism community, identity first language is becoming sort of the chosen version of the language. So when we talk about Maggie, this is when I talk about it can get really complicated. I say that Maggie is an autistic person with albinism. So I'm using both in one sentence. Do I get it perfect 100% of the time? No. And for all we know, 10 years from now, when Maggie's a teenager, she's going to tell us, I prefer this or I prefer that. And what we will do is change and adapt and change our language. But I think this is a real life example of how different communities have their own preferences. And all you can do when you receive feedback on that is just take that information in, remember it, and move forward. Does anybody have any questions about person first versus identity first language and how to use it or where or when to use it? Of course, Jenny says, thank you so much for addressing this. And of course, I think that the person first versus identity first thing is right now, especially if you follow a lot of popular disability rights social media accounts, it's a bit of a hot topic. And Heidi is going to talk in a minute about the word disability, but I think along the same lines, another hot topic of conversation is sort of euphemisms for the word disability. Things like, I'm trying to think of all of them. It's like whenever I need to, I can't recall them all off the top of my head. Things like special needs, handy-capable, alter-abled, all of those. And there's a sort of movement around being able to talk about disability and use the word disability without it being negative, which is exactly what Heidi is going to address in a second. Victoria had a question. So is it best to ask the person what they prefer? I think depending on the situation, yes. I think if you're just encountering a patron with a disability and for some reason you know that when you look at them, like maybe they are a wheelchair user or they have some sort of mobility aid, I think you could use either or. If I'm trying to think of an instance where in a library specifically where if somebody asked me that, so maybe if there's a specific instance, Victoria, that would be helpful. But I'm just thinking like if I entered the library with my kiddo and one of the librarians was like, hey, does she prefer person first or identity first language? I might be like, well, let me get, would you like the 10-minute speech? You know, and not, I would appreciate that question, but I don't know that everybody would in the same way. So I would just pick one, either person first or identity first, use it. And if somebody corrects you, move forward from there. Okay. Any other questions about person first and identity first? No. Okay. So this next slide, on the top, again, it has a white background, and on the top it says, what if disability isn't negative? Can we, quote unquote, ordinary it up? And then underneath that, I found this block of different emojis that Apple just came out with recently that are all different disability related emojis, which I thought was a wonderful example of sort of ordinarying it up and bringing it into everyday vernacular, which emoji is sort of like its own version of language right now. And clockwise from the top left, we have a here an ear with a hearing aid attached to it. A person, half of a person's face with their finger on their cheek with a couple of marks signaling motion. A person walking with a white cane, a yellow lab seeing eye dog in a harness, a prosthetic leg, a person in a motorized wheelchair, a person in a non-motorized wheelchair, and then a prosthetic arm.
Thanks, Katie. And if you're one of those people who wants a list of what to do, like this is the definite list of what to do, this may not be the place for that, because so much about language is relational, it's living, it's evolving, it's contextual. And so our hope with bringing some of this content to you today is to provide some context, some things to think about, some questions to ask as you engage with people in new ways. And with that awareness, maybe just some deeper understanding about not just the what of language, but the why of language. And this isn't in my bullet points, but I'm going to add it in just because I'm sometimes spontaneous that way. Does anybody here, and I'm aware we're in a Zoom space, we don't really know each other very well, so this is just an invitation, not an expectation. But does anybody have any thoughts about like why language is important? And that can go in the chat box or out loud. Like, what is so important about language? You might guess I have some thoughts myself, but I do want to, invite anybody to think about and share. Again, no right or wrong, just why might we do a whole workshop on language?
I think there are some people typing.
Okay. Thanks, Katie.
Word choice, this is from the chat. Word choice can indicate our attitude about the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Language can create barriers, and it creates a tone.
Yeah, thank you.
Because language, there's a bunch. Hold tight.
Okay. I'm hanging on, I'm loving this.
It's great, yeah. Because language is powerful and can be hurtful. Feeling validated and understood, words are powerful. Can help create common understanding, but it is also evolving. Words, by definition, are a form of classification. And one reason is that it's one of the ways that we relate to each other and identify ourselves and each other. Megan says, that's a big question. I think language can say a lot about how we think about people, things, and what we can imagine for ourselves. I am loving all of the librarian responses or library employee responses when we talk about language. I was so excited, honestly, this is a side note, to do this training with people in libraries because you all love words and language. I'm assuming.
Thank you. And again, there's not a right or a wrong. But one thing that the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we referenced in the first workshop, one of the things it protects is effective communication. So for me, and one thing I think about as a language and a word lover myself, is that it enables connections to be made, it enables communications to be made both within myself, but with others, and also with others. So one of those many beautiful chat box responses mentioned barriers. It can create barriers. It can also create connections. And so when we think about and we untangle, unravel, dive more deeply into the word disability, we're going to just take some time to look at, identity first, person first. Those are all parts of movements within the history of disability becoming something that's more embraced and embodied from a society that for a very long time has had some negative connotations for disability. So this slide really, the question that occurred to me almost as an epiphany several months ago. I've been living with a disability for close to 30 years. And I will tell you that the internalized ableism I experienced linked to productivity and capitalism, I think it was maybe the summer of 2020 where I said the words, I can't, and actually didn't feel badly about myself. We're so, I think, socialized to believe that the more we do, the better we are. And that might be a very narrow and maybe my own personal experience. So I'm open to other feedback, but just from the context and from the language itself, when we see the first three letters dis often implies something negative or something outside the sort of primary acceptable thing we want. So disability in and of itself, I think, can be internalized or understood as negative. And I will own that for myself. I didn't want to be disabled. I kind of wanted to prove some sort of worth for many, many years. There's probably still threads of that in me. So the question, what if disability isn't negative? What if it wasn't something to be pushed away or hidden away, is really, I think, a very, another air quotes, big question, but just something to think about as you're interacting either with yourself, with family, with community, with patrons, that not everybody necessarily processes this all the time, but if we can make space to slow it down a little bit and think about the other contexts that people are in, what if we just ordinaried up disability? So all of these emojis that are on this slide that Katie was talking about, it was a difference. Is something that we just, with universal design, had multiple options to engage so that people can connect and so that people can communicate effectively in the ways that they want to. I might add in artistic a create on that, but this is a big question, but I think it's really important when we think about language and how it's used. In the phrase ordinary it up, I think, again, having had some lived experience where access accommodations, I always feel, I often feel like I'm asking for something extra, or it's a burden, or it's like too much time or too much money. But if it was ordinary, if access and the ways that we welcome people are just part of what we do, rather than in addition to it, what would that be like, or what could that be like? And I think understanding the desire to connect and create and learn and communicate of all people, as humans, and sometimes to be alone, actually, that maybe not all the time, all moments, but I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense to people? I'm just looking for the thumbs up or in the emojis.
Looks like yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then again, to just reiterate Inclusive Arts Vermont's approach, and this, I think, parallels some of the identity first language, where we take a position or a perspective of disability pride. We don't want to name the experience for another person, because it's not that disability is any one thing. It's just a multitude of things. Sometimes it's challenging, sometimes it's meaningful, all of it. But we don't perceive it as negative. And I think sometimes that can be different for people who are in other contexts that we mentioned before, some of the medical model, other social models and cultural models. So if we can get outside of, good or bad, right or wrong, positive or negative, and just recognize that disability is part of lived experience and there can be pride in it. And so identity first language, identity first communication, I think in many ways is, it parallels kind of a reclaiming or a pride. And a side note on that language choice, we sent out a handout ahead of time, not having expected that you would review it. But it's called Choosing Words with Dignity, and that advocates for person first language. It also talks about certain words, kind of like do's and don'ts. Like handicapped is not a current word that is embraced by many people. However, I know people who use the word handicap a lot because they think it's better than cripple, like in this hierarchy, in this evolution of word, language, and choice. And some other people use the word crip as an empowering stance, as an identity first kind of pride thing. There's actually a film through Netflix, a documentary series, a film called Crip Camp, which I don't know, Katie, if we can put that in the chat box, or I can certainly send it out after. It does a great history of the disability rights movement with some of the leaders in that. And also just the name Crip Camp kind of reflects that embracing and that celebration of an identity that had been marginalized in many ways. So we're getting to this position of our perspective of pride, which can run counter to some of the mainstream or other contexts. I think the next thing, Katie, would be the next slide, if you would.
Okay. So this slide is a white background, and there are 4 circles that are, you can imagine them on the 4 lines. If there were sides of a square, there would be 1 circle on each side, or rectangle, I guess, in this case. And the circle at the top, it has the word message in it, and it has an arrow going to the circle on the right-hand most side. And inside that circle, it says decoder, interpreter, and encoder. And then there's an arrow going to the circle on the bottom that says message. And then there's an arrow going to the circle at the left that says encoder, interpreter, decoder. And then an arrow going back to the top circle with the word message.
Great, thanks, Katie. So this kind of image, there's degrees, there's so many workshops about communications, and we're talking about language here and word choice and selection. But I think this is a really helpful kind of visual and concept to have, because for any opportunity for communication, there is going to be a very, very ordinary opportunity for miscommunication, because the message, if you will, the word, it starts out as one thing. But if you then pass it through the loop of, the encoding, I'm not remembering all of the things there, the encrypting, the coding, the recoding, there's lots of ways that this can get interrupted, and there's lots of barriers. One of them might be, so say the 2 bigger circles are people. If one person has a vision loss and somebody's using the communication, let's say not a word, but maybe a facial expression, like they're smiling or they're winking, that's not going to be interpreted or encoded in the same way, just because of the nature of the one person who is the communicator. I have a young person in my life who happens to have hearing loss, and he was mentioning to me that apparently his tone sounds a little sassy, but he can't hear his tone. So all of these ways that the message is sent, it's not always the same as the message that's received. And that is with the most care, the most, thoughtful words. Sometimes just as ordinary for it to get miscommunicated or misunderstood. And I mentioned that, and I think it's really important that it's the practice of choosing words and being thoughtful and having organizational and library discussions about, are we going to do person first as an organization, or are we going to do identity first? All of those things are really important. And sometimes there will just be something that you have to say, oh, thanks for letting me know, and just readjust the communication, almost like a dance, if you will, a back and forth, and recognize that the message sent is not always the message received, and just be aware that that can happen. We'll get a little bit more into some of those pieces. And the last thing for this section I want to talk about is the question came around, do you ask the person, and in what context? I think that there are some contexts where, if you're not talking about how people identify or label, it may not be relevant. For our masked exhibition that features 21 Vermont artists with disabilities, there are written statements, there's artist statements, there's communications. We do artist talks, so we communicate publicly about them in social media and newsletters. And so in those contexts, we ask people to tell their own story, if you will, or we invite them to tell their own story. And I think this is a concept when we're talking about accommodations, there's all of these big things like laws and policies, and then there's the person, so with the masked exhibition, and we can send this link to some of the artist statements, we invite artists to tell their story, and some people mention disability and some don't. And I think it's really important, not just, kind of person first or identity first language, but also what part is relevant. Some artists, their disability is so woven into their creativity and their creative process and their journey, and they're very explicit about that. And others, it's not that much of interest. And so, or maybe today, maybe that will change tomorrow. One of the openings that Inclusive Arts Vermont did a couple of years ago, I remember kind of this moment of, I had my name tag on, and somebody came up to me and they were pointing to a piece of art behind me, and I'm poking my hand now for visual description. And they're like, what's that one's disability? And while we do these exhibitions and we want to have conversations around disability and inclusion and access, what I said in that moment, after a little bit of a squirm, because for me, it was like, this is about the art, and then for the audience member, and this could be for the patron, they were curious about the disability. And what I kind of came to in that moment and what I responded to was, wow, like this gallery has artists with disabilities, and the artists tell their own story. So some mention disability and some don't. And the entry point is the art. And I think, depending on, what your programs are and, how you want to communicate, just know that people are human. Language is living and evolving, and that the power of a story and, how you would respond if somebody asks, like maybe you're doing a library discussion and somebody asks a question about that person in the wheelchair, or that, like just how to hold space for different perspectives and people being in different places. But also you can always, refer back to the person. I don't know, let's ask the person, or let's see, that's a curious question. So we don't avoid the conversation, but we also, can just be mindful that sometimes it's relevant and sometimes it's not. And it's not negative, maybe, just maybe disability isn't negative. Katie.
There we go. Sorry, rearranging and getting everything back where I could see it. Great. So are there any questions about what Heidi and I have talked about so far? Okay. Feel free, if you have questions, to put them in the chat as we go, and I'll make sure that we come back to them. I'm going to talk a little bit about, and Heidi and I are going to sort of go back and forth here, and talk about approach. So how do you put this into practice at your organization? I think I'm going to go a little bit off of our outline here. And one of the first questions we get from people is, how do we write about this on our social media or our website, or how do we talk about accessibility and people with disabilities without making somebody mad? And I'm going to say something that might be hard. And I think I might have even said this to you last time. It's a common thing we say to people when we're talking about accessibility, which is you're never going to get it 100% right 100% of the time. And that is because we're all human beings with our own individual preferences, and what might work for someone might not work for somebody else, and how one person wants to identify might not work for somebody else. So just keep that in mind, that all of this does have a little bit of squishiness. But right now I'm going to talk about practical use of language, and back to, I think it was Victoria's question about asking people, and this is specifically about offering assistance. We talked about this a little bit last time, but if you don't know what someone needs, you can always ask. And by asking, what you're doing is letting them define their experience and what they need assistance with. So the language to use for something like that would be like, do you want help with that thing? Or do you mind if I? And let them tell you. I think a very classic example, again, from the book I talked about last time, Sitting Pretty by Rebecca Tossig. She talks a lot about people wanting to be kind and wanting to help her get her wheelchair in and out of her car, when if people asked, she would say no, because it's faster and actually probably safer for the wheelchair for her to just do it. And when you ask someone if they need assistance, assume that people know what they need. Assume that someone will tell you what they need, assume that people know how they want to identify, and leave it at that. So the next is communication between people, and this is a little bit of reiteration from last time, but I think it's important to mention again. When you are engaging with a patron of the library or a visitor to the library who either has a sighted guide with them, maybe they are blind or have low vision, or they're using an American Sign Language interpreter, or even an interpreter for a different language to English, or some sort of companion, you want to speak to the person and not the person assisting them. That's really, really important. So instead of me saying, hey, Karen, will you tell Heidi, etc., etc., or Karen, can you ask Heidi what type of book she wants to find today? I would just say, Heidi, what can I do for you today? Straight to her. Another piece with language is, I think this happens a lot in New England especially, is to be patient, speak slowly, wait for a response from people. I think us humans have a tendency to want to fill in the void or the silence. And if you ask someone a question, giving them the opportunity to give you a response back, rather than either guessing or trying to fill it in, to fill the awkward silence, just let the silence be there and give them a moment to process and then answer you, which also goes with pacing. And then again, this is, I don't think we can really say this enough, is to always ask rather than assume when it comes to helping. So that's sort of some practical stuff on spoken language and things you can do with language, and how you interact with people. Heidi, do you want to talk about communications?
Yeah, thanks. So there's, again, lots of things on communications. Inclusive Arts Vermont has done some trainings with the Vermont Arts Council that are archived for specifics on social media and other pieces. We will send more resources later. But these are just some bullet point tips. And the first one is get rid of the $5 words if you can use a $1 one. And this phrase was shared with a colleague that used to be doing trainings with us, and I love it because I tend to be maybe not even a $5 word person, but a $10 word person. I think it's beautiful or poetic, and it's not always clear. So for me, this is one of those things where I constantly edit or revise myself as I go, and I don't always get it right, and I don't always know it until the moment until somebody's like, "Heidi, what are you saying?" And I'm like, "Oh, thank you." So, yeah, just look at word choice and try to be mindful that clear communication sometimes is the $1 words, and that's really valuable. Another piece in writing and written communications is readability. And I'm going to ask for a thumbs up, yes, in the chat box, or if you're on camera. Have people heard about the Readability Checker or the readability scales through the digital technologies? How many folks here have heard of that?
Looks like a couple, maybe. Yeah, a few. Okay.
So readability is an important factor. And, there's readability, for screen reader users. Does the digital technology work? That's not what I'm talking about here. That's important, and there's resources on that. And if you're interested, we can archive, put those in the chat box. But this is the language clear and effective? Things like, not having run-on sentences or not using the passive voice, just being mindful of those things. And there's ways to check that. I have taken some bullet points from the Word program that I use, but each program is a little bit different. So if you don't remember the exact details, just remember that you can Google or try to find in the help section how to check the readability of a document. And I was doing some tech stuff with a person just yesterday, and I sent him the same link that I was looking at, and his screen, it was a web link. It looked at it differently. So I'm thinking, Katie, if I asked you to screen share, it might not be the same way. So for readability, if you go in the Word program, if you go to review and you look under review, there's an editor, and you click onto the editor.
Actually, Heidi, hang on one second. I can share it right now.
Okay.
I can do it with the outline I have up. So I'll share that while you talk. So keep talking, and I'll sort of circle my mouse where people should go.
So if you're not a Word user, just know that this exists. And if you want to come to office hours, we can work together on this. So Katie's going to go to the review part in that file menu.
Yep. So review is along the top bar, and then all the way on the left-hand side, there's a little pen logo with some lines next to it, and it says editor. And when you click that, it will pop up something on the right-hand side. And I'm going to type some words so that we have something to check.
Okay. So the way that I did this was when there was an outline up and I had spelling and grammar errors. Just a side note, I was spinning loops and loops and loops until I checked all the grammar and spelling errors, and then it gave me the readability scale. So if you're trying to find readability and it's not showing it, it might be that there's a spelling or a grammar error that you have to review first. But what it's going to pull up is this there's a flesh Kincaid scale that gives a percentage. I honestly haven't Googled to find out what that means. What we look for is the readability, and it'll give you a grade level. And that
I need 100 words apparently to do this. So we're
oh my gosh.
there we go.
This is live. This is Katie and Heidi in the moment.
Yeah, it's not doing that with this one. Let's see. Formal.
While Katie's trying to get the visuals there, things to remember. It exists, a readability scale exists within the program. You're looking for the readability of, we try to do 8th grade or under, just to make it accessible to lots of groups of people. And if you have spelling or grammar, it may not give you that calculation. I don't know how they calculate it exactly.
I got it, Harry.
You got it? Okay.
Yep. So what you all saw me do when I ran through those ran through those spelling and grammar things, it needs to be these check boxes on the right-hand side for spelling and grammar. You need to not have any errors. So you can press ignore to everything and tell it to ignore it all. That's a good start. So at the top, it gives you your word count, character, etc. Then averages, so number of sentences per paragraph, etc. Readability is the part we're talking about at the bottom. Now, this score is really good. It's because it's an outline, which has very short sentences, very simple words. I would say on average, if I'm writing something like a grant application, usually the grade level comes out to be around 10 to 12. And this reading ease, it's based on a score of 100 being a perfect score. The grade level is what I was talking about with 10 to 12. And then passive sentences. Removing passive voice from a piece of writing is the #1 way to improve the readability. So removing passive sentences, shortening your sentences, and simplifying words, so like shorter words. We recommend anything public facing should be 8th grade level or below. That is harder than you think, particularly if you're coming from, like academia sort of writing or anything like that. It's actually harder to do than you think, but I think it's really important. So that's how you find it and how you get to it in Word. And I did post a link on how to get there in the chat. And now everyone's seen our outline too, so you can see the back end, all my secrets.
Great, thanks, Katie.
Yeah.
I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to go through these next bullets. Sending information ahead of time, if you have it, so print materials, like we send the know before you go. That gives people a chance to process, read, review the information at their own pace. And sometimes people like to be able to do that before they show up and are expected to participate. So sending information ahead of time. It's also fine to send it after, but for a more synchronous event. Also just to be aware of the language and make sure it promotes kind of positive and affirming images of disability. That's probably a whole other topic, but just there are some things that just don't feel as appropriate as others with regard to disability. So language that's inclusive and stories that are inclusive and, affirming. And then the last sort of bullet point is to include the question mark access symbol in materials. We said this last time, I will probably say it every time, but if you're, this would be registration materials or program materials. If you put out to the public and to your patrons, if people have an accommodation request, who to make that request to, and both an email or a phone, and how to make that request. Sometimes there can be a deadline to have the request made by, so that you're on the back end have time to prepare and coordinate if needed. But that really just communicates that you're open to, willing to make accommodations, and takes some of the effort about for the person who would be making the request, how to find you. Just kind of, can't say this enough, but it communicates way more than a little question mark might suggest in terms of your welcoming and openness to providing accommodations. And I think that's it for the bullet points. There's probably more we can go into more. We'll send some resources after, But are there any questions right now based on what we've kind of gone over, or anything? Questions, comments?
I did, while people are thinking of any questions or comments, put in the chat box a few links. There's a link to the Crip Camp movie that Heidi and I talked about, which provides a really interesting background to the disability rights movement in the US, if you're interested in that. The link to Microsoft's information about how to get to the readability scale, the link to choosing words with dignity, and a link to the question mark tip sheet. I'm not seeing any questions, Heidi.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask for one more level of engagement. This will be a word game. If you have, one word to think of in response to today's content, and this isn't like a force it, but just if there's one word that you're taking away from today and you wanted to put that in the chat box, that would be great.
We have ask, loving, encouraging, context, flexibility, be open, thoughtful.
I was about to say everybody stayed to the one word so far, and then Katie said be open. I always say one word, and I'm like, it's hard to do one word, I know. Great. And some of this, you sit with, and just becomes part of what you integrate. And my guess is people are doing this already in bits and pieces, if not fully. So.
Let's see, open. Oh, the person with two words, be open, changed it to open, just open.
Oh, I was being playful.
They are too. There's a smiley face after. Okay. Assuming playfulness. See, look at this language. I'm assuming that means playful. Hopefully it does. And Holly says communication.
I think the emoji, thank you for that. I had it on my bullet point as an add-on that we, in Western culture, there's a primacy of words, and certainly we love words, but there is a visual communication language of emojis, and those can be misinterpreted too. But I think it's also just really important to know that, like as the nonverbal, the gestures, that sort of thing, the visuals, it's a way of communicating and connecting. And thanks for editing to the one word, because that makes me smile. Just the playfulness.
Right, there's one more, awareness. And to close us, I guess I'll say, so Heidi is going to send out an email like we did last time that has a link to the survey. We really appreciate those who filled it out last time. We mean it when we say we take those really seriously. And if you take a few minutes to fill it out, if you have feedback for us, we try to directly apply it when we can to future sessions. So please provide feedback if you have it via the survey. The recording of this training will be available on the Department of Libraries website along with a transcript. And I think that's it. What comes next? I can't remember. Is it a training or office hours?
I think it's office hours on June 2nd.
Great. So those office hours, just so folks know, it's a time to come. It's a really informal time for you to come and bring any questions you have related to accessibility to us. Can be something we've covered or not. You could bring us a flyer to workshop, an issue you've had in your library that you need us to help you solve. Anything and everything related to accessibility. Come hang out and chat with us.